It's been some time since I've stepped back into the world of Project Warlock 2. Developed by Buckshot Software and published by Retrovibe, Project Warlock 2 began its early access period on June 10, 2022, and concluded it on May 28, 2025. Nearly 3 years. I was quick to cover its first early access build, which had some clear flaws, but also lots of positives and potential. Over a year later, I would put out a video on its then newly released Chapter 2, which felt like a more focused effort despite a few questionable design choices. It also brought with it a revamped Chapter 1, which was a vast improvement. Following that, I haven't touched the game, due in large part to other life commitments that caused much of my channel hiatus last year, but also because Warlock 2 clearly had a lot more development ahead of it. With its upcoming Chapter 3, and more redesigning, overhauling, tweaks, and fixes in store with its already released chapters. And frankly, I felt my time was better spent waiting for the full release. Well, now the full release is here. Project Warlock 2 is finally in 1.0. I've played through all the stuff Buckshot has been hard at work on these last 3 years, and in this video I'll be covering most of it. All the stuff that brought me smiles, and all the stuff that brought me frowns. Is Project Warlock 2 the new king of the boomer shooter scene? Let's find out. Project Warlock 2 is of course the sequel to 2018's Project Warlock, one of the first popular titles in the boomer shooter wave, taking inspiration from early 90s FPS classics like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, but spicing up the classic run and gun with an infusion of RPG mechanics and sporting a variety of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror themes. It's an awesome game and a must-play for any classic FPS fan. Warlock 2 shares much of this core DNA, but strives to take it to the next level, drawing its inspiration from mid to late 90s shooters like Quake and Unreal, with a focus on fast-paced movement and platforming, putting Warlock's blocky maze-like levels aside for expansive, vertically designed courses, begging to be explored, and giving you lots of reasons to do so, not to mention broadening its RPG aspects. However, its big front-of-box feature is that it has 3 distinct protagonists, Palmer, Erd, and Kirsten, each with their own 12-mission campaigns, with distinctive themes, unique arsenals, as well as mechanics. Indeed, this is an ambitious one, especially for being an indie shooter. Okay, so getting into it, since this game is split up between 3 distinct campaigns, I'm going to start with covering the overarching aspects shared by all 3 of them, and then dig into the individual campaigns and their specifics. First thing that I'm happy to say, which has been true since Warlock 2's first early access build, is that the game feels good to play. Mechanically, it is ideal for a classic FPS experience. Its movement brings lots of freedom and air control as you spring and soar throughout levels, and is responsive and tight enough to allow you to weave through mobs of baddies with ease. The shooting feels powerful, hunky, and chunky, making for satisfying combat as you cause legions of enemies to explode into tiny red sprites. And the game's combo system helps drive this. There's of course that simple urge to get as many kills as possible just to get that number higher, but the higher your combo is, the more experience kills will grant you. So if you want to level up quickly, kill quickly, and often, it's good fun dopamine-inducing stuff. There's also a fairly developed damage system, where hitting the enemy's limbs not only does a certain amount of damage, but also adds a certain amount to your combo multiplier, headshots naturally being the most damaging and additive for the multiplier. There's also damage types that can be played with. Each Warlock features elemental damage abilities that can whittle down health bars faster with status effects like burning and poison, not to mention bleed that can be caused by slicing weapons, such as a sword, increasing the amount of damage done to them. These aspects are a solid way to keep players mindful about how they slaughter, and the game will give you a report card on your score and accuracy. But admittedly, when you're in the midst of a large, frantic, and crowded battle, which is most of the game, it's likely you won't be paying much attention to any of this, or at least if you're a new player, opting to focus on staying on the move and keeping your fire consistent. Plus the fact that many of the enemies will glom together and will be obscured by gore effects, you likely won't be able to see where you're specifically shooting anyways. While for me, the damage system was a little hard to keep my focus on, I did appreciate its inclusion. Stepping into the arsenal, each Warlock has 6 weapons they can play with, and each of those 6 weapons can be upgraded to 2 alternate possibilities, bringing the total to 18 weapons per Warlock. Keep in mind though, the player will have to go through their campaigns multiple times to enjoy all of them. Each of their weapon sets are made up of most of, but not all of, the classic FPS weapon archetypes. A melee, a pistol, a shotgun, a rapid fire, and something that goes boom, often lending a good balance of long-range precision and crowd control. However, these weapons are not cut and paste between the Warlocks. One Warlock shotgun or machine gun is going to have different quirks, qualities, and feel compared to the others, which will alter how a player uses them. Not to mention, the player's upgrade choices can radically affect these weapons and their overall build. We'll touch more on the upgrade system in just a bit. In general, I would say majority of the weapons are fun and effective to use, with a few here and there that didn't feel as useful as its counterparts or that I just plain didn't like. I also can't forget that each Warlock has a trio of cooldown abilities, one that gives them a temporary buff, and 2 elemental attacks. These abilities grant a major advantage in combat, like inflicting enemies with the status effects I detailed earlier. But as with the weapons, there's a few here and there that just didn't do it for me. I'll touch on those specifically when we go through the individual campaigns later in the video. Overall, while they aren't perfect, I think the developer was successful in making each Warlock feel unique and fun, and each of their quirks complements the game's core mechanics nicely. Something you will encounter throughout the game is the AI being pretty funky, or just plain dumb. The enemies do have trouble navigating the environment. An all too common sight is seeing a horde of them jammed up on a sharp corner, or stuck on a ledge they can't jump up on, or just completely frozen on a platform. While this is far from the game's biggest problem, seeing this stuff did pull me out of the experience. Each character has a home base they'll return to between each mission. Here they can level up their stats and upgrade their weapons, among other things, using various collectible tokens found throughout each level, often through secrets, making secret hunting an integral aspect of this game. The leveling and upgrade systems are largely an iteration on the ones found in the first game. Players can funnel points into strength, health, spirit, and capacity, which in turn unlocks various perks to purchase, like being able to swap weapons faster, extend combos, pass through enemies, and my favorite, making them explode with headshots. This time around though, each Warlock has 2 new categories they can spend points on, representing their 2 elemental damage types, which in turn boosts the amount of damage they do with said element, and also unlocks passive perks. So for instance, having a high enough poison stat for Erd unlocks the Poison Cloud, where you have a 10% chance of spawning a poison cloud whenever you kill an enemy. It's a straightforward system, but easy to grasp, and with clear benefits that will be felt in gameplay. The weapon upgrade system is a lot more robust compared to the first game. Once again, each weapon you collect can be upgraded to one of 2 possible variations, often either improving upon the weapon's qualities or completely changing it, like turning a crowd control weapon into a long-range precision one, or a rapid slicing melee weapon into a slower but more powerful crushing type. And after that, an additional upgrade can be purchased, granting the weapon an alternate fire or buff, like scopes and grenade launchers. A new aspect are the enchantment runes, that grant weapons a percentage of elemental damage based on your stats. The catch is, to use these runes, the player will have to complete a rune quest, which essentially boils down to getting a certain amount of kills with that weapon. It's a cool aspect that gives the player more options in how they tailor their builds, although I wish there was a little more to the side quests, as they are fairly easy to pull off and feel a little tacked on. These upgrade systems are a core driver of Warlock 2's replay value, as players are able to create different builds with each playthrough, use different perks, go with different weapon loadouts. I can't say it will radically change the experience, but it can alter it enough to make multiple playthroughs an enjoyable time. My only gripe is I wish there was a way to respec stats and rollback upgrades, only because a first-time player could accidentally upgrade their arsenal in a way that could limit them or negatively affect their build, or just because they don't like either of the weapon upgrades and would prefer to go back to the weapon's original form. Granted, each weapon upgrade is detailed in the upgrade menu as well as the codex, so it's not like you don't have all the info, but I don't think it would be that big of a deal to have some sort of respec feature, and if anything, you could put a price on it so players don't abuse it. Last thing on the home base is that I wish there was a way to teleport back to completed levels for the sake of obtaining any missed collectibles or just fully completing them. In fact, there's no option to play single stages in any way, which is a bummer as the feature was in earlier builds of the game. However, there is the new Realm Shift mode that unlocks after completing the whole game. No, it still doesn't let you choose single stages, but it does act as Warlock 2's New Game Plus, allowing you to play the 3 chapters with any of the Warlocks and with all their base weapons unlocked from the start, making it an easier way to experiment with builds. An appreciated mode all around that further bolsters the replay value. One interesting thing to note is that after Mission 7 of each campaign, the game activates Hard Mode, which is evident by the red label at the top of the screen that can't be turned off. When Hard Mode comes on, there is a chance the game will spawn tougher elite monsters that are faster, deal more damage, and have more health. Hard Mode also unlocks the game's passive abilities, which can be purchased at your base with tokens collected in levels, affording you various buffs to your stats and abilities, as well as some debuffs as a trade-off. Hard Mode isn't optional, which I stress because when it first happened, I got confused and thought I had accidentally opted into it and started rummaging through my menus to see if I could turn it off, mostly to get the red label off the top of my screen. But alas, to no avail. I have no issue with this quote-unquote mode though. The elites add some nice spice to combat, even though they mostly feel like spongier versions of the normal enemies and aren't that tough to deal with, and the passives add another fun layer to fleshing out your build. I just think it's odd how the game implements it. Like having elites and passives unlock after Mission 7 could just be a thing the game does. I don't know if I have to enter some new mode and plop this red label at the top of my screen. Okay, I'm mostly irked I can't turn the label off, which I know is largely a me thing, but I like having as little UI as possible and this isn't adding anything. Like if Hard Mode was an optional thing I had to turn on, then yes, it would make sense. Otherwise, this is totally unnecessary. Stepping into presentation, throughout early access, Warlock 2 has gone through some visual evolution. The first campaign in particular, Palmer's, is far more detailed and rich when compared to its first release. Textures and geometry are stronger in most parts, and overall atmosphere is better, especially in the later levels of that campaign. And similar improvements can be felt in the second campaign featuring Erd. A pleasant surprise for me was finding many of the 2D sprite elements were either improved or completely redrawn. Many of the weapons have been spruced up with cleaner, more detailed sprites and lots of smooth reload and fire animations, which for me was a treat as I'm a sucker for good sprite animation. I also love the approach to the enemy designs, looking like 3D assets that were converted to sprites, an aesthetic inspired by the mid to late 90s games that Warlock 2 takes its cues from. And I love the personality that comes across with each enemy, even if the most subtle aspects are hard to see in the midst of carnage. But one of the biggest improvements is the UI, which has been completely redrawn. It's cleaner, simpler, but more stylish, and sports new character portraits that look fantastic. I didn't mind how the UI looked before, as it felt in line with the first games, but this is night and day. One thing I loved about this game, and also loved in its predecessor, was its visual themes and more so the mixture of them, with each campaign featuring a distinct one within the umbrella of or adjacent to sci-fi fantasy. Palmer's campaign is very much medieval fantasy with cybernetic undertones. Erd's introduces a Western theme that is played against supernatural horror, with its enemies based on folklore creatures like vampires, wendigos, and Sasquatches. And Kirsten is firmly in sci-fi, with her world feeling retro-futuristic, in the style of old 1950s alien movies. But her weapon set feels one part part satanic, another part eldritch horror, which made for some delightful visual contrast. I love seeing visual variety of this sort, especially since it all feels cohesive within Project Warlock's vibrant universe. But while I found a lot of good qualities to the visuals, unfortunately I found the environments to be very hit and miss. At best, they are well detailed and vibrant, stirring up some good nostalgic feelings. At worst, they look like cluttered, confusing messes, with some that are desolate and dull, and unfortunately they get worse as the game progresses, with portions of the later maps looking just plain sloppy and rushed. The first Warlock shot for an aesthetic that on one hand felt like 8-bit retro, on another an edgy indie comic, and Warlock 2 follows the same vibe, with thick, inky blacks and lots of contrast. And 9 times out of 10, I love that look. In fact, I think Warlock 1 pulled it off nicely. In 2 though, it just doesn't hit for me. I think the reasons are because the devs relied on a shader effect to add contrast and shadows, used at its heaviest in Palmer's campaign, coupled with the textures now sporting blotches of shading and shadow to give them more depth. And while there's nothing wrong with these techniques separately, when mixed together I feel they muddy and darken the image to the point where maps are somewhat hard to read, and crush the colors, giving them an unattractive baked look. And just a heads up, I turned up the gamma on a lot of this to mitigate the effect. One tiresome aspect is that many of the levels feature 2D sprite decorations, such as trees, mushrooms, cactuses, to, of course, add detail and characterize the maps. And these assets do look fine by themselves, but I think they tend to detract from the visuals by making sections look more cluttered than they need to be. And more often than not, they got in the way of combat, obscuring enemies or valuable pickups. And going along with this, while the sheer scale and chaos of Warlock 2's combat is often a good thing, there are times, once again primarily in Palmer's campaign, when the sheer number of enemies on screen, coupled with the volume of particle effects, also coupled with the decorative sprites and whatnot, can turn the screen into an absolute mess where I have no idea what the hell I'm looking at and I'm essentially firing blind, praying I don't get killed. And when this happens in some of the tougher arena fights and boss battles, it can feel like an unnecessary hindrance. When you examine the levels closely, you'll also find plenty of unpolish, misaligned textures, awkward geometry that borderline looks like a mistake, and some odd texturing. Like, here is a wooden structure that's damaged in parts, but when you look at the broken edges, it's using stone textures. That doesn't make any sense. And admittedly, those things are pretty picky on my part, but it's something I kept noticing throughout the whole game, and more disappointingly, in levels I know have been spruced up and redesigned multiple times. I'm not going to harp too much on the bugs and performance issues because Buckshot are actively putting out patches to address many of the things I ran into, and much of what I'll say will likely be outdated. But that's to say, I did run into many a bug and visual glitch, as well as performance drops. Performance drops that were there since the very first builds. And one problem that has persisted since the first early access build is enemies being able to shoot through walls and clip through walls. As of the latest patch, I was still seeing this happen. Look, clearly a lot of work went into these levels, without a doubt, but my feelings are that they needed a lot more polish, and why that didn't happen in the 3-year early access period is up for speculation. But overall, in terms of visuals, these levels fell quite short for me, and I really hope they get some TLC in future updates. Okay, now that we've spent plenty of time looking at the game from a top-down view, let's journey to the ground level of the individual campaigns. The first campaign, Palmer's, appears to have been designed to be reminiscent of the first game. Set in medieval fantasy maps full of castles and dungeons, highly reminiscent of the starting maps of Warlock 1. And in general, I feel this campaign also harkens the most to classic FPS archetypes and tropes, right down to the structure of it being a gradual descent into hell, or rather a hell-like place. Really, it's a smart way to kick off the game. Hook in players with a campaign that will feel familiar to them, whether they be Warlock fans, classic FPS fans, or both, and then afterwards introduce them to the new and different concepts in the preceding campaigns. Compared to the other campaigns, Palmer's has gone through the most improvements and redesigns. In the first build, his campaign featured 6 giant non-linear levels that were impressive in terms of scope, but frustrating to play through as they were confusing to navigate. Lots of running around in circles, not knowing where to go. Sometime later, these 6 levels were broken up into 12 smaller ones, and this was a huge improvement, making them easier to navigate while also upping the overall pace. In their final form, I think Buckshot has hit the sweet spot. They feel focused, lend a good brisk combat-heavy pace, but are still big enough to lend some good non-linear exploration, but not so non-linear that you get lost or confused. In fact, I can't say I ever got lost in any of Warlock's campaigns. There's good and bad to that, as I'll touch on later, but rarely did I have to rely on the map, which is good because I still think the map system is bad. For me, it's just convoluted and hard to read. If you're trying to navigate a single floor area, it's fine, but as soon as you add vertical layers on top of it, it just turns into a mess. Honestly, who is this helping? Palmer's weapon set is the most straightforward compared to the other Warlocks. His starting weapon is an automatic rifle, providing a good balance of power and accuracy. It serves as a clear example of how a weapon can be upgraded to player preference, as it can be turned into a heavy rifle, a more powerful version increasing damage and speed at the cost of accuracy, solid for crowd control, or the burst action assault rifle that has a tactical level of accuracy that makes it ideal to pick off baddies from afar. Both are solid options. FPS fans will also love the Super Shotgun, which scratches that Doom 2 Super Shotgun itch while having more control to it, seeing as both barrels are fired individually. It, however, can be upgraded to a beefy automatic type that is devastating in akimbo. More on that in a bit. We can't forget his sword, which is a valuable thing to swap back and forth from as it causes bleed. However, not something I love to use solely, as enemies have a pretty generous range at which they can hit you, and it can be hard to predict when they will attack. So going at enemies purely with melee is a good way to quickly diminish your health bar. To be honest, the rifle and shotgun are more than enough to get the job done with Palmer, as both are good for just about every combat situation. Maybe too good. But the staff can be a good rapid-fire alternative, especially if you go the tactical route with the rifle, although it can be morphed into a hard-hitting laser weapon that is fun to melt enemies with. The cannon is a bit of an odd duck. As the name implies, it shoots a cannonball that can splat through enemies. Fun to watch and do, but it can feel redundant next to the rocket launcher that more or less does the same thing. However, the cannon can be changed to what is essentially the Unreal Tournament flak cannon, shooting out a flurry of smaller cannonballs. Essentially another shotgun, but one that put a big nostalgic smile on my face. The star of Palmer's cooldown abilities is being able to go akimbo with any of the weapons, which might be the most satisfying thing you can do in the game, especially when using the shotgun or rocket launcher. And I think they did a good job balancing it by giving it a lengthy cooldown and limiting it to one weapon at a time when activated. With his other abilities, while Palmer's flamethrower is quite powerful, I found it awkward to use. It has a slow windup and it requires you to get pretty close to enemies, making it more of a liability in combat. Whereas the ice attack fires quickly and depending on how high your frost stat is, will freeze nearly all enemies in their tracks, opening them up for attack and for the lesser types, insta-kills. This was my go-to throughout the campaign. While I enjoyed Palmer's campaign, I have to say the latter maps of it were pretty irritating due to some sharp difficulty spikes. You encounter these sizable arena fights where droves of enemies are just dumped on you. Loads of high-level monsters, including elites, and a legion of small fries in between. Now look, I love a good challenging FPS that can kick my ass, and there are plenty of good challenging ass-kicking portions in this game, but these fights were just too overwhelming. If I didn't stay on the move, I was dead in seconds, but everywhere I went was saturated with enemies, and I couldn't see what was going on because of all the effects and junk in the way, not to mention all the baddies attacking from a distance that were hard to keep an eye on. Earlier, I complained about how the amount of stuff happening on screen can turn everything into a big mess where it's hard to see what's going on. Yeah, these are where that complaint stems from. Exasperating this was the fact that mobility was limited, as some of these portions had lava hazards around them or were in constricted spaces. In fact, one of the chief ways Warlock tries to kill you is by cornering you in small spaces where you can't escape. The moment I focused on one enemy, I got killed by others running up behind me and on my sides. And something I haven't mentioned yet is past their vocals and roars, the enemies move silently and can easily sneak up on you, which is annoying. When I was first playing these portions, I wrote in my notes that it was like being in the ocean and trying to jump over a large wave that just smacks you down. And as soon as you come up for air, another one smacks you down, and then another, and another. And finally, when the waves subside and you can catch your breath, some dude up on a cliff snipes you. Now, this is on the hyperbolic side due to the fact that I was pretty frustrated when I wrote it, but honestly, that's what my feelings were. And even when I came back for another playthrough with sharper skills, I still found it to be overly difficult. I mean, if you're gonna smack the player this hard, at least save it for the final levels of the final campaign. Spoilers, they don't. This was a blotch on an otherwise decent campaign. But just because I like to leave things on a positive note, I will say Palmer's final boss is the strongest of the game. Intense and difficult for sure, but satisfyingly so. An even mixture of puzzle solving and combat. Erd's campaign is my favorite of the game. I think it's the most well-rounded, is consistently fun, and has some of the tightest design. The first thing to highlight are the levels. I feel that Erd's maps were designed in reaction to the criticism and redesigning of Palmer's first gargantuan maps, and indeed, these ones feel a lot more focused. While they are shorter than Palmer's maps and more linear, on average they have a good, speedy flow to them, with tons of well-designed combat portions that are difficult, but difficult because the individual enemies and the combinations of them are difficult, not because the game is overwhelming you with them. But while these maps are more linear, they still have wide open areas begging to be explored, full of secrets and other goodies to uncover. These maps also flirt with some spectacle, which is fun to see. The campaign begins with a literal bang as you outrun an explosion you triggered, and a prominent mission in the campaign has you jumping cars on a massive speeding train that naturally crashes, with the crash site serving as a large explorable battleground. The one big bummer is that the final boss stage is pretty underwhelming. While the scope of it is large and impressive, once again embracing some spectacle, it's a puzzle battle with a solution that is very easy to figure out. And while there are plenty of enemies to get in the way, most players will likely wrap this one up quickly and feel the dull sting of anticlimax. In my original review for Chapter 2, I said that I liked Erd's weapons, but didn't think they were as satisfying as Palmer's. That opinion has changed. Erd's arsenal slaps. Her starting revolver is a hard little kicker and immensely fun as it can be rapid-fired like a gunslinger, and headshots do not take up bullets, making it possible to keep the fire going indefinitely. But the Magnum it can be upgraded to is a thing of beauty, a beastly damage dealer that is highly accurate, able to one-shot lesser enemies and allowing you to joyfully leapfrog from kill to kill. If you're interested in more damage, you can also change it to the pellet revolver, which feels like a sawed-off shotgun. The pump shotgun may not be quite as satisfying as Palmer's, but it's a lot more accurate. But its updated sawed-off variant is about as good as it gets with FPS shotguns. Less accurate, but insanely powerful, with a good pace to its fire. But if shotguns aren't your jam and you want more range, it can also be changed into a powerful rifle. The Uzi is hard-hitting but inaccurate, easy to ignore next to the likes of the pistol and shotgun, but its crank gun upgrade, while slow to fire, is phenomenal for circle-strafing tough enemies to oblivion. Erd forgoes a traditional melee weapon in favor of throwable daggers that I enjoyed most against pest types, but if you prefer it, it can be morphed into a spear that can pierce through enemies or an axe that can cause area damage. The dynamite is where it's at though, reminiscent of Caleb's dynamite bundles from Blood, albeit far easier to use. I had an absolute blast literally and figuratively wiping out enemies with it. Gotta watch out for that splash damage, though. Two of Erd's cooldown abilities are magical spells read from her spellbook. A poison attack that not only poisons and damages enemies, but leaves behind poison clouds to infect others. the trade-off being it can obstruct your visibility. Next to that is the Crystal Spell, feeling a bit like a shotgun blast, and where it lacks in creativity, it makes up for in effectiveness, as it can blast right through shielded enemies and cause a bleed effect. Urd's cooldown buff consists of a speed boost, which when coupled with the dynamite can make her a blistering fast powerhouse. The speed boost can also be used with her magic spells, bringing more delightful pain to these supernatural foes. In all, I found her abilities equally useful and valuable in combat. The third campaign belongs to Kirsten the Demon. It was finally dropped into the game earlier this year and was what I was looking forward to the most when I ventured into this 1.0 release. And while I feel that Kirsten's campaign is the most creative of the bunch, it easily is the most disappointing. Kirsten's weaponry is the most unique looking, as most of her implements are some sort of biomechanical nightmare, looking as though they were pulled from the mind of David Cronenberg. However, at first, they are very similar to Palmer's arsenal, with a rapid-fire rifle that is a bit less accurate than Palmer's, a fast-firing shotgun, and her melee scythe isn't too far off from his sword. However, it's with the upgrades that her arsenal really comes alive. For instance, the laser rifle can be morphed into a minigun that was a go-to for me against crowds and tougher enemies. But the railgun variant is the bee's knees, or rather the demon's hooves in this case, able to pierce through multiple enemies with a sea of wonderful red splats to follow. The shotgun can be turned into an auto shotgun similar to Palmer's, but it's the nail gun variant that I love, spitting out a flurry of ricocheting nails that can clear out a whole room in just a few shots. And her scythe can morph into a heavy hammer that might be powerful, however I wasn't fond of it as it was on the slow side, which is why I far preferred the rapid Wolverine Claw variant. Her plasma rifle is one weapon in the game I did not love, as its widespread made it feel ineffective, and its firing animation obscures the screen too much. However, its upgrades improve upon these lesser aspects, in particular the Demon Core. A notable difference with Kirsten is that her weapons don't use traditional ammo clips, but rather generate heat. And when they overheat, they trigger a cooldown minigame where if you click that little yellow square, the cooldown will complete and you can go right back to firing your weapon, with your initial shots being buffed for extra damage. However, if you miss the yellow square, the penalty is a prolonged cooldown. If you're thinking this sounds an awful lot like the Gears of War reload system, you would be correct. It's more or less copy and pasted from that game. Initially, I found the system to be pretty annoying as I often failed it, but over time, as I got a feel for it, I came to appreciate the advantages it brought. For example, Kirsten's powerful auto shotgun overheats quickly, but with a successful cooldown, almost all of its next shots will be buffed until the next cooldown, making it so you can string together a powerful series of buffed shots. On paper, Kirsten's 3 cooldown abilities are the most interesting, but in practice are the least satisfying and in one case, borderline useless. The best of the bunch is spawning hellish slaves, basically a bunch of demons that will fight for you for a limited time. I have few complaints as it does as advertised. The Demon Hammer in its initial form is most effective against slower stationary enemies, but fairly ineffective against faster enemies in groups due to its slower deployment and less than accurate aim. In fact, the hammer was most irritating because aiming it not only felt unpredictable, it also felt broken. Sometimes it would hit right where I was aiming, but often it would go way too far past my enemy or sometimes right behind me, and the frustration of this was enough to make me ignore it. There's the option to upgrade it so that it spawns a bunch of scythes that will remain in the area and damage enemies. I recommend that. Soul Bargain is pretty fascinating. When activated, if Kirsten dies, the Grim Reaper will save her life. However, she'll have to eliminate a certain amount of enemies in a short time to pay him back, or else she'll go right back to being dead. The catch is, she can only use her melee weapon to do so. What makes this interesting is that it's up to the player to anticipate when they will need it, as they have to die within a timed window to be resurrected. They can also screw themselves with it, as despite being brought back, if there aren't enough enemies to kill, or nothing but tougher types that might take too long to dispatch with her melee weapon, well, there's not much that can be done. It's not the flashiest or funnest of abilities, but it does require the most strategy, and when used correctly, can be a huge lifesaver. Literally. But where Kirsten's campaign really disappoints is in its level design. So before, I said that Erd's maps felt like they were designed in reaction to the first versions of Palmer's maps, embracing more linearity but keeping things wide open to maintain a sense of exploration. And I felt they nailed it. With Kirsten, it feels like they grossly overcorrected. To put it plainly, these levels are way too linear and way too short. Like most levels take only a few minutes to complete short. Sure, you can pad that time out with secret hunting, but not by much. And where Palmer and Erd's campaigns have a more wide-open design, granting players room to explore, Kirsten's is almost completely devoid of that sort of thing. Now, one of the maps does take advantage of its brevity, where you have a limited supply of oxygen and need to get to the end before it runs out, with hordes of enemies to slow you up. Now, I don't know if this level really pulled it off to a satisfactory degree, because the level is so short, you'll likely have enough oxygen to reach the end, but I like the idea of some type of element putting pressure on the player to finish as fast as possible. That would be a clever way to justify their shorter, more linear design. But unfortunately, this is the only level where something like this occurs. Look, I don't think these maps are horrendously terrible. There's definitely good design to be found in them. It's just surprising to me how much of a step down they are compared to the first two campaigns. Through all of Buckshot's redesigning, tweaks, and trial and error on them throughout early access, I truly feel like they got their level design figured out. They figured out the balance. And here, it's like they disregarded all of that and took an overly safe direction. I'm sure I'm not correct in what I'm about to say here, as it is an assumption, but to me, it feels like the devs went, screw it, let's get these done quickly and out the door so we can finally hit 1.0. Again, I'm likely wrong on that, but that's how it comes across to me. I know I keep harping on the fact that this game had a 3-year early access period, but it had a 3-year early access period, and this is how they ended it, with a brief whimper of a campaign and easily the worst final boss of the game, both in terms of design and performance, which was a stutterfest at times. And it's also a shame because while she has her flaws, Kirsten is genuinely an interesting character to play with a fun weapon set. I mean, thank God for Realm Shift mode, where we can get the most out of her in Palmer and Erd's campaigns. So, after 3 years of early access and many hours on my part spent in various builds, at the end of the day, I feel underwhelmed by Project Warlock 2. The game has clear strengths, it's mechanically satisfying and overall fun to play. It has some solid replay value, and many aspects of the visual presentation are charming. But on the flip side, there's lots of unpolished to uncover throughout the experience. Some mediocre looking maps, difficulty that feels severely unbalanced in parts, lackluster boss fights, and a third campaign that is a complete letdown. In all fairness, I do think the core strengths of the game do overcome some of the flaws. And if you are someone that just has an itch for an old school shooter that feels good to play and has a decent amount of hours to it, this will scratch it to satisfaction. But I do think for those that are deeply immersed in the boomer shooter scene and put a lot of hours into the first Project Warlock, it's hard for me to say this will meet your expectations, especially if you're someone who has been patiently waiting for this since it entered early access. My feeling is that this game bit off way more than it could chew. The concept of this sequel taking Warlock from a quote-unquote Doom-style FPS to a Quake-style FPS was always a solid, inspired direction. But all the other stuff it promised from the get-go, 3 unique Warlocks, 3 unique campaigns with distinct themes and enemies, dozens of weapons, tons of abilities, and at one point massive non-linear levels and unique RPG leveling systems for each character. I mean, from where I'm sitting, that ambitious scope was one of the biggest hurdles that kept the game in early access for so long, and led to so much redesigning and overhauling. And was that scope really necessary for this title? True, Warlock 1 had a lot packed into it, but at the end of the day, it was a tight, focused, and fun shooter. And above all else, I think that's what people wanted from a Warlock 2. And while I absolutely admire Buckshot's ambition and chasing of such scope, I think it was misguided. And frankly, throughout the early access period, as Warlock 2 lessened its scope, focused its levels, cut aspects, and compromised others, It got better. It did. And I think there should have been more taken out. This is going to sound brutal, but I think the whole Chapter 3 should have been cut or set aside as a post-release DLC. Because if the game hit 1.0 with just Palmer and Erd's campaigns, I would have felt it was a solid shooter with some drawbacks. But the third campaign, I think, drags the whole package down and really makes me question the overall scope, really makes me question if it was worth it. Now, I'm not saying this to punish the developer. No, I think Warlock 2's development is pretty indicative of the challenges of game development, of the creative process in general. There's always problems, there's always redesigning, there's always compromises. And I think it was amazing how transparent Buckshot was and how they embraced player feedback. And if I had a penny for every video game that had to lessen its scope during development, I'd probably be cruising around on my solid gold yacht named the SS Hyperbole. No, I say all this to urge the developer that when they make Project Warlock 3, and I think they should make it, yes, you need to offer something new and fresh, but you don't need to cram the game with this much scope and go for this much content, especially if you maybe don't have the team and resources for it. The focus should be on making a tight, fun shooter, because that's what your audience ultimately wants. And if that means having a scope that's comparable to the first game, that's okay. Trying to have more for the sake of having more is an easy trap to fall into. And I don't think Warlock fans are going to have the patience to watch another early access campaign like this one. It's that thing of I would rather have 2 hours of the most amazing gameplay ever than 18 hours of just okay. And after 3 years, that's where Project Warlock 2 landed. Just okay. Anyways, that's it for me. What are your thoughts on Project Warlock 2? Be sure to let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, subscribe, share, and smack that bell. If you want to come say hi, my Discord is linked below along with my affiliate links. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.